And joining us to discuss this topic is Javier Palomarez, founder and CEO of the U.S. Hispanic Business Council and former Obama campaign advisor. And we have Vance Ginn, president of Ginn Economic Consulting and former chief economist of the White House's Office of Management and Budget. So good to see you both here today. Vance, let me start with you. How significant is this $2.5 billion in blocked loans in practical terms for the U.S. economy?
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. And I think that many small businesses have been relying on these dollars flowing in. And so this will be a hit to their revenue in order to cover their costs. And so it may be that they delay investments, raises, things of that nature. Well, at the same time, I think it also shines the light on how many businesses are dependent on these government loans. And so I think that's something else that we need to look at, because at the end of the day, it should be about profit and loss in the private sector, not based on Small Business Administration loans that are sent to places like Texas, where I live, or other places across the country.
So, Javier, let me go to you now. From what you've seen, what has been the impact on small businesses?
Well, I think, Don, you have to look at it in its entirety. We find ourselves right now in a situation where this shutdown is one for the history books. The healthcare of 22 million Americans hangs in the balance. Those Americans typically are working in small businesses. The big corporations can afford to ensure and make sure that their employees are healthy. Smaller businesses cannot. We're 22 days into this shutdown. That's already the second largest in history. Trust in D.C. is at an all-time low. Prior to that, we had the tariffs, which increased prices, made supply chains a bit more difficult to deal with. So we had supply chain challenges to deal with, tariff price increases to deal with, a 22-day shutdown. Healthcare in the balance, that's front and foremost for every small business owner, is the healthcare and the well-being of our employees. Now you've got a situation where the SBA has kind of frozen up. You're talking about overall about 1,616 loans every week that are not being looked at and therefore not being approved. That's nearly, on a national level, nearly $900 million a week that is not being approved and not being put into the economy that was already earmarked. These are not increased dollars. These were already, approved for funding. And when you look at the states that are most impacted, you got California, you got Texas, Florida, and New York. If you do an overlay of the concentration of Hispanic businesses in this nation, guess where they are? California, Florida, Texas, and New York. Disproportionately, the American small business community, the American family is feeling this. It's a difficult time to be a small business person in America right now.
So, Vance, I have two questions for you. One is, do you think the lack of loans could translate to higher unemployment rates? And another is, I want to follow up on your point earlier where you mentioned that small businesses should rely on themselves more rather than the government. Can you explain that further? Why do you think that should be the case?
Yeah, I think when you're a small business, you're running your business, you're looking at your revenue, your costs, you usually have pretty tight profit margins that are there already. And so the Small Business Association loans can be kind of your lifeline for a period of time in order to fund wages and other types of earnings for your business and for your employees. And so for that sense, it can definitely influence a lot of their business that they're doing on a day-to-day basis, which is unfortunate. My hope is, though, that we will end the shutdown quickly, one that will the Republicans put forward a clean continuing resolution that the Democrats now want to add $1.5 trillion more dollars in spending on healthcare related expenditures, mainly for Medicaid, that were extensions during COVID and from the Biden administration. Well, initially by Trump and then by the Biden administration. And so this is really creating the economic damage, if there is going to be any, from this shutdown. Because remember, we also got to think about, we're running about $2 trillion a year in deficits that were contributed to by the COVID shutdowns and then the Biden era of excessive government spending, which also led to high amounts of inflation. all these things now are contributing to a burden on these small businesses. And at a time when the Small Business Association is also not able to give out a lot of these loans, that does put a hefty burden on them of whether or not they should hire more people, not hire more people. So your first question about whether or not there will be an increase in unemployment, I think it really depends on whether or not this shutdown lasts for a lot longer, and whether or not those private businesses have other resources, other ability to gain access to credit or access to funding so that they can fulfill all of their expenses on a monthly or even a daily basis. And so I think time is still going to tell, but I'm hopeful that Republicans and Democrats can come together, at least pass the clean CR, and then let's talk about healthcare and other things thereafter.
All right, Javier, what do you think about this idea that the private sector should rely more on itself in the event of a government shutdown such as this? The impacts will be more limited.
Clearly, every business should fund itself. Every business should be responsible for its own, livelihood and its own profitability. But the vast majority, and I'm talking in excess of 95, 98% of American small businesses don't rely on SBA loans. So let's put that in its proper context. But again, a small business doesn't exist in a vacuum. All of these things are impacting ultimately the American small business community and the American family. The two are intrinsically tied to each other. When you look at a government shutdown, when you look at tariffs, when you look at supply chain challenges, all of this is happening at the same time. And if you are a business that, yes, in fact, does rely on some government SBA loans, then yes, absolutely. When you cut off access to capital, that's the lifeblood of a business. Operational disruption happens, stunted growth happens, increased financial strain happens, and ultimately you start seeing businesses close their doors, which of course increases unemployment. Everything is tied to each other. There's nothing that happens, in a vacuum here. What we need are our Republicans and our Democrats to come together, do the job that they were frankly put in place to do. This is not a Democratic issue. It's not a Republican issue. This is an American challenge. And I'm not in the business of politics. I don't care whether a Republican points to a Democrat or a Democrat points to a Republican. It's their fault. I don't care whose fault it is. It's all of their responsibility. Fault or not, it's their responsibility to get this thing fixed. We got to fund the government. We got to get back to business. We got to open up the SBA, and we got to fund somehow the Affordable Care Act tax credits that are necessary for 22 million American families. Those families don't work for Exxon. They don't work for Bank of America. They don't work for Goldman Sachs. Those people are very well taken care of. This does not impact Wall Street, but it devastates Main Street. Those people, those 22 million Americans, are generally working in agriculture, in construction, in hospitality, in manufacturing at a small business where we cannot afford to buy in bulk at a discounted rate insurance for our employees. But this is a real American crisis, and we need both sides to quit playing politics and get busy and get this government back up and running.
Okay, so Vance, if you have a response to that, I'd like to hear it. But I also wanted to ask you as well, because you mentioned earlier, you questioned whether the government shutdown would have any impact or lasting impact. Can you go a bit deeper into that? Clarify for us, do you think government shutdowns will have any permanent impact on the economy?
Well, I think it certainly will have an impact on the federal government employees who have been furloughed, maybe even got a RIF, meaning that they're going to be let go. I mean, certainly their families are going to be struggling. They just missed their first payment. But what we've seen in the past with government shutdowns is that they'll reimburse, they'll fund that period of time. So usually it's a shift. Instead of spending more this month, they'll just spend more in the next month. So the economic effects really are just a shifting around of the timing, although that doesn't help with the families who are going to be struggling during that period, which is one reason, I agree with the other guest about how Democrats and Republicans should be coming together and enforcing something that allows for the government to open back up. We just started the new fiscal year, and so there's a lot of different dynamics that are going on. The only thing I would say in response to the other guest is that, the 22 million sort of tax credits, I mean, a lot of this was an expansion of Medicaid to many people who were not eligible and they were for income or for ages because they've aged out. They're too old, or their incomes have increased substantially since COVID. And I don't know why we would want to continue those sort of emergency types of items that were during COVID when the Biden administration ended the emergency declaration. And so I think it's time to get back to some sense of normal, and having that many people on a Medicaid program where coverage does not equal care does not improve patient care for Americans. At the same time, it raises taxes on everybody. Nothing is free, including those Medicaid tax credits, and to the tune of about $1.5 trillion over time if the Democrats get their way. So I think that we need people to come together, but let's also look at what the economic and the fiscal situation that we're in to allow for people to prosper. I think that's by expanding government.
Okay, Javier, you talked about sentiment earlier, and I want to continue a little bit on that. SBA Administrator Kelly Loeffler said confidence at a 7-year high. Can you tell us what you're seeing right now with the confidence level among businesses?
You know, it's funny, Don. It's a great question. It's a great question because we're hearing on both ends of the spectrum. You know, when we first started seeing some of the tariff scares, of course, we were as concerned as anybody else. Then we saw what was actually going to happen and did happen. For example, the EU deal, you know, the deal that President Trump struck with the European Union is a boon for the American economy. It's fantastic for manufacturing and particularly the automobile industry. So, you know, there's some real great news there. We love the attention to traditional energy and bringing energy costs down. That's fantastic news. The extension of the 2017 Tax Jobs and Act that ultimately really, for the first time in decades, really offers some relief to the American small business community in terms of our taxes. There's lots of good news here. At the same time, however, we're facing the uncertainty that you know the government shutdown has brought about, this SBA stall. You know, at the end of the day, you know, small businesses suffer, the entire nation suffers. We don't have lobbyists in Washington, D.C. We don't have big marketing departments. We don't have divisions of tax lawyers. It's just us. But at the end of the day, we account for 99% of the businesses in this country. We employ almost 72% of the nation. We create 70% of the net new jobs in this nation. We account for 45% of our GDP. We are an important element of the American economy, but we're disparate. We're not huge companies. It's only when we aggregate our voice, and thankfully we have outlets like yours that allows us to come on the air and talk about our concerns, because this is a challenging time. It's full of good news, but definitely there's some bad news and some trying times right now.
Well, really appreciate that comment, Javier. And Vance, I'll give you the final comment here. Anything else you'd like to add? I mean, do you think this shutdown could potentially affect global confidence in the United States?
It's possible, and Don, it's always good to talk with you, and Javier as well. I mean, it's I think these are the types of discussions that we need to be having, and too often we're not having those across different types of the spectrum in America. And so when you look at this shutdown, you look at the effects on small businesses and many families. We need to say, okay, what are the proper roles for government? Where should the government be coming in? And my argument has been that we're doing already too much. The government's already involved with so much, and so the more that we see those effects that happen now, in my view, that would indicate that we need less government in our lives, less government in businesses, and less government spending, including the Small Business Association loans, is really allowed for that to happen in the productive private sector. So no matter where the volatility happens within government, from one president to the next, from one party to the next, they're going to be in a much stable footing for their future if they are more self-sufficient with their own business, with their own families and communities. I think that's really the path to prosperity.
Well, all right. Great discussion today. Thank you both for coming on.
Thank you.